Well, thank you for tuning in for this presentation about the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem and the sum and substance of what happened there. Father Daniel Grody of the University of Notre Dame takes a lot of groups to the Holy Land, and I think what he says about focusing on their trips to the Holy Land is important for us to remember about this presentation. He says there are three texts to our lives about what we should focus on whenever we are talking about visiting the Holy Land. First is the text of the Scriptures. What do the Scriptures say to us as we focus on what happened in the Holy Land? Second is, what is the text of the land, the nature of the land and what happened there? What does the land have to say to us? And then finally, when we finish this presentation, what is the text of our lives? What does the reality of the Holy Land and tonight Bethlehem say to all of us? Very quickly, I want to cover where we visited in the Holy Land to give you an overview before we settle down to look deeper into the Bethlehem story. And there is a reason for this that I will mention at the end. After flying all night from Newark, New Jersey, we arrived in Tel Aviv, which is just north of the ancient town of Joppa. And just to focus on that, here's Joppa. Just on the north side is Tel Aviv, and then we started moving north. We loaded onto the bus and traveled to Caesarea along the Mediterranean coast, which was the site of King Herod's summer palace. It was here that the Apostle Paul stayed in a cell in Herod's palace for 2 years. Herod liked to have discussions with him. But then Paul was shipped to Rome to stand trial, where he would ultimately be martyred. Recall also that when Peter was in Joppa, staying with Simon the tanner, he was summoned by a centurion to come to Caesarea, and Peter converted the centurion, which was his first conversion to the Christian faith. From Caesarea, our group from St. Francis, as well as St. Hilary and Fairlawn, we journeyed to Mount Carmel and then on to the Capernaum by the Sea of Galilee. And it was here in Capernaum where Jesus stayed with Peter and Peter's mother-in-law for 3 years in his public ministry. The house has been confirmed, Peter's house, and today there is a church built over the house. But you can see the interior of the house from the ground or through the floor of the church where we had Mass. Our boat trip on the Sea of Galilee was very special. So special that no one talked for the first 10 minutes on the boat. We all had to have some quiet time. It's important to note that within a 4-hour walk from Capernaum, and 4 hours was not deemed to be a long journey in Jesus' time, but within 4 hours from Capernaum, where Jesus stayed, over 80% of the New Testament is covered, and we saw it all. Nazareth, the multiplication of the loaves and the fish, the transfiguration, Cana, where the married couples on the trip had their marriage vows renewed. And incidentally, they have some great Cana wine there. I bought a bottle for us to have in the evening. And then we went on to Magdala, where Mary Magdalene was from, and much, much more. When we arrived in Jerusalem, we arrived at the backside of the Mount of Olives, and the bus stopped at a high point overlooking the ancient city of Jerusalem. Similar to our time on the Sea of Galilee, when we got off the bus and saw that ancient city, everyone was silent, and it was hard to talk. Shira, our Jewish guide, understood and had prepared some bread and wine for us and offered a Jewish prayer, and that helped us get back on track. Next to the Mount of Olives is the Garden of Gethsemane, and for me, my favorite daily Mass was the early morning Mass, which Father Tony and Father Steve from St. Hilary celebrated. They used an outdoor stone altar and we sat on stone benches. Behind the priests was the lower level of the Garden of Gethsemane, and beyond that, where we could see, was the ancient city of Jerusalem, a very short distance away. We walked down the large path that Jesus was taken from the garden after being betrayed, and we spent a considerable amount of time in Jerusalem, close to 2 days, including the Wailing Wall, the Via della Grossa, the Way of the Cross, where we had an interesting incident that happened as we took turns in groups of 4 or 5 to carry the cross. The pathway was what we would call a large alley today. There were shops on either side of us. And what happened to us as we carried the cross, in a small measure, is what happened to Jesus as he carried his cross. And that can be covered at a later time. We visited the upper room, Golgotha, and many places where we were visited and took some time to pray and were humbled. In addition to Bethlehem, we also visited Ein Karem, where Elizabeth and her husband Zachariah were visited by Mary for 3 months prior to the birth of John the Baptist. And I'll have more to say about that in this presentation. And of course, we made our trip down into the desert to visit the Dead Sea, Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the ancient fortress of Masada, and the idolic preserve of Ein Gedi, where David hid from King Saul while King Saul was trying to find him and kill him. It is said that David wrote many of the Psalms while hiding in Ein Gedi. And so, why did I give you this brief overview? Well, if you find that you've received some value from tonight's presentation and you would like to visit other parts of the Holy Land, please contact Nancy Fiamingo and let her know. Perhaps as we approach Lent, we can take you down to the desert. It's a desert experience for us as we focus on prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. And then we could take you to the desert of the Holy Land and match that up with what we celebrate during Lent. And then perhaps just prior to Holy Week, we could visit Jerusalem and see what Jesus saw and try to understand more fully the sacrifice of the cross. So now, come with me, come to Bethlehem. While our journey with Christ begins with his birth in Bethlehem, the journey for Mary and Joseph to travel to Bethlehem began in Nazareth. And here you see the saying, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. What you see here is modern-day Nazareth. There are 2 hill areas in the city. One was the original Nazareth, where Joseph and Mary lived, and the other was unoccupied in ancient times, but now is part of the greater Nazareth metropolitan area. Nazareth is the capital and largest city of the northern district of Israel. It was founded as an early settlement 2,200 years before Christ, according to archaeologists, and it became recognized as a major city in 300 years AD, 300 years after the birth, so that in Jesus' time, it was still considered to be a very backwaters town. Residents of Nazareth were, for the most part, simply lumped in as Galileans, referring to the greater landscape of Galilee. In the time of Jesus, Nazareth was a small, secluded village. It was not located on any trade route. No prophecies were given about Nazareth in the Old Testament. And in fact, the Old Testament never mentions the town. The Annunciation, the angel Gabriel in the book of Luke alludes to a humble virgin in an insignificant place, Nazareth, being chosen to be the mother of God. Today, Nazareth is known as the Arab capital of Israel. In 2016, its population was 75,922. The inhabitants are primarily Arab citizens of Israel, of whom 69% are Muslim and 30.9% Christian. Nazareth Illit, which means Upper Nazareth, was built along Old Nazareth and has a Jewish population of over 40,000. The Jewish sector was declared a separate city in June 1974. Much of the old town in Jesus' time is now underground, and portions have been discovered, including what is believed to be Joseph and Mary's house. And we were there, and that's a visit for another time. Although Mary was about 1 to 2 weeks from having her child, Joseph was obliged to leave Nazareth for Bethlehem, as he did not want to risk being punished for not paying the census tax. And probably it was God's will which made him take Mary as well, so Micah's prophecy about the coming of the Messiah could be fulfilled. But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from ancient times. The exact route Mary and Joseph took to get from Nazareth to Bethlehem is not described in any of the Gospels. However, according to the writings of the ancient historian Josephus Flavius, quote, "It is the custom of the Galileans at the time of the festival to pass through the Samaritan territory on their way to the holy city." So we can suppose that Mary and Joseph might have taken a way which they would have usually taken to go to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. And here, I just wanted to point out, so we're up in Nazareth is up in this area here, and they would come right down through Samaria, right into Bethlehem, right down through here. There exists another theory, because of conflicts between Samaritans and Jews at times, that Mary and Joseph may have chosen the way through the Jordan Valley, crossing over mountainous terrain down to the flatlands by the Jordan River, following it to Jerusalem, and then walking west to Bethlehem. This would have been a trip of some 90 miles and would have been a grueling journey, exposed to the desert along the Jordan, which was hot during the day and very cold at night. So some people believe that instead of coming down through Samaria from Nazareth, they traveled to the Jordan River on the west side, came all the way down, and then over to through Jerusalem to Bethlehem. Very hilly country. Most biblical historians believe the holy couple took the route through Samaria. From Nazareth to Bethlehem, the distance is about 80 miles. Today, it is referred to as the Nativity Trail. The trail passes through beautiful, though sometimes rough terrains of rocky hillsides and valleys, and multiple green olive groves, such as you see on the slide. Today, as in ancient times, people can walk the distance at about 20 miles per day from Nazareth to Bethlehem, taking 4 days to complete the journey. However, Mary was deep with child, probably 10 to 14 days from giving birth when she left Nazareth. It is doubtful they were able to cover more than 10 to 12 miles per day. If Mary was able to ride a donkey, as she is often portrayed in the Gospels, donkeys usually play out from carrying anything for more than 4 to 5 miles a day. They just don't have the stamina. With Mary walking part of the way each day to give the donkey a rest, they could have covered 12 miles each day, depending on the weather and the terrain. So it is quite probable the journey took from 7 to 10 days, which cut greatly into the time that Mary would bear a child. Another reason I believe this is the route they took is that this undoubtedly was the same route Mary took almost a year before, as she traveled to see her cousin Elizabeth in Aim Karem. Elizabeth was in her 6th month of pregnancy, and Mary had just conceived Jesus by the power of the Holy Spirit. Mary undoubtedly traveled with a group of travelers, as was the custom, to travel through Samaria to the Judean hills. Mary stayed with Elizabeth for 3 months until the birth of John the Baptist, and then returned to Nazareth. It is believed she was about 4 months pregnant before revealing her condition to Joseph. But as you can see on the map, Ein Karem is only 7.5 miles from Bethlehem. Possibly, this was where Mary and Joseph made their last stop before reaching Bethlehem to register for the census. And remember, Elizabeth was married to Zechariah, a Jewish priest in Ein Karem. Hold that thought for later. Here we see the ancient town of Bethlehem. In your mind's eye, ignore the view of the apartments occupied by the Arab Muslims in the one photo on the upper right. And just picture in your mind rolling hills intersected with rocky slopes along with grassy areas. Bethlehem in Hebrew is pronounced Bethlehem, which means house of bread. How appropriate then for the Son of God to be born here as he who would become the bread of life for all of us. This town, called the House of Bread, offered pristine rolling terrain used as large grain fields in ancient times. After the harvest, the shepherds would be invited to graze their sheep on these slopes, eating the remaining grains and nubs of the grain stalks. And by so doing, the sheep would help fertilize the fields for the next growing season. And what about the shepherds in Bethlehem who would play such an important part in the birth of the Jesus story? Shepherds in ancient times were the lowest form of laborers. If you couldn't do anything else, you were a shepherd. Their sole job was to protect sheep. They trained to use a sling and stones to ward off the wolves and small lions, and they were very good at it, as witnessed by David, a Bethlehem shepherd who slew Goliath in the Elah Valley with his sling. What you see here in the slide are 2 small caves, and there are numerous caves like this in the area. These are the kinds of caves the sheep would be moved to for the night, and the shepherd would sleep at the opening to protect them from wild animals. But, and this is a big but, the shepherds in Bethlehem were not ordinary shepherds. They had a special mission. They were called Levitical shepherds, charged with the sole mission of raising lambs for the temple sacrifice in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was only 3 miles from Bethlehem. And it was in this very fact that we find the divine essence of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, as he would be chosen as the ultimate sacrifice for all of us. When it was time for a lamb to be born in Bethlehem, they were placed in shepherds' caves, otherwise known as birthing caves, and these birthing caves were kept in a state of ritual purity, since the lambs were destined to be used as sacrifices in the temple. In fact, many of the male lambs born around Bethlehem would also be used for the Passover. On the slide, you can see us sitting in one of the pictures here, part of our group, sitting in one of the larger rooms of a cave complex that was used as shepherd's home for birthing the lambs. These shepherds were responsible for making sure that the newborn lambs did not contract defects, for only animals without spot or blemish could be used as a sacrifice in the temple. Baby lambs are very clumsy when they are born, so many scholars believe that these shepherds would swaddle their newborn lambs with cloth in order to prevent these future sacrificial lambs from becoming blemished by injuring themselves on jagged parts of the cave. Once swaddled, the baby sheep would be placed in feeding troughs, otherwise known as mangers, to further protect them. It would be impossible to birth lambs in the small caves shown previously, which were used as sheltered grown lambs during the night. Now, Scripture talks about swaddling the baby Jesus. A key aspect of swaddling in ancient Israel was salting a newborn. It was a sign of covenant, as in the phrase, a covenant of salt, found in numerous places in the Old Testament. And it helped prevent bacteria from forming on a newborn sheep or a baby's body. The swaddling clothes were sometimes used from the tunics of priests when the tunics had become too worn to be used in priestly garb. And here on this slide you can see a drawing of a priest with all the various parts of his clothing, and including the white tunic that goes underneath it. Each piece of clothing had a purpose, as the priests of today wear, although not quite elaborate. It's a good thing our priests don't have to dress up like this. It would probably take half of the Mass time to get ready for Mass. The main purpose of used cloths from the priests' tunics was to serve as wicks to light the candles of the menorah. Levitical priests lit the menorah in the sanctuary every evening and then cleaned it out every morning, replacing old wicks with new ones. And what were the wicks of the menorah made from? Well, the priest's tunics. And as I mentioned before, Levitical priests took care of the temple sanctuary, and Levitical shepherds were charged with taking care of the sheep destined for the temple sacrifice. Jesus' birth in Bethlehem was prophesied 700 years before Jesus' birth in the book of Micah, chapter 5, verse 2 in the Old Testament, as mentioned before. And it's important we repeat this. But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from ancient times. Now keep that thought in mind when we talk about the three wise men and Herod in a few minutes. Because of census requirement, small Bethlehem was surged with people. There was no space to accommodate Mary and Joseph in whatever arrangements normally would be used for travelers stopping in Bethlehem. Nor, it could be speculated, could Mary and Joseph have been able to afford to pay much for boarding there anyway. So they were shown the way to the only space available, the large cave complex used to shelter animals and shepherds, a portion of which was used for birthing sacrificial lambs. And we went through that cave complex on the trip. Today, the Church of the Holy Nativity is above the portion of this large cave complex, considered to be the birthplace of Jesus. The cave complex extends further, over which exists a Greek Orthodox church. Both churches on the surface are connected, just like the cave below, so a visitor can walk from one church to another without stepping outside. Now, what you see also on the slide in the circle is the spot designated as the birthplace of Jesus. And behind the camera, when I took this picture, about 10 feet, is where allegedly the manger was used to feed goats and sheep, and that was also used to lay the newborn baby Jesus. And we waited and moved slowly for 2 hours to be able to descend into the cave area to see the birthplace. So, what does Bethlehem mean in toto? Jesus was not only born in Bethlehem, which is a city of David, but he was also the promised son of David, the Messiah and King that came to fulfill the Davidic covenant. God's promise that one of David's descendants would live on the throne forever and to establish a new covenant as written in Jeremiah. The days are coming, declared the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and the people of Judah. Baby Jesus was swaddled like the newborn sheep being raised for the sacrifice. Joseph would have washed the baby upon birth with salt and water to prevent skin infections, and then he was wrapped in cloth. Quite possibly, if Mary and Joseph had stopped in Ein Karem before arriving in Bethlehem, Mary's cousin Elizabeth, knowing the impending birth of Mary's child and the couple's economic state, could have given them some of her husband's older tunic cloth to clothe the soon-to-be-born baby. Remember, Elizabeth's husband, Zechariah, was a Jewish priest. It is also quite certain that a midwife or two would have come to assist in the birth. First, because midwives were an integral part of assisting in the birth of babies in ancient Israel, and that they would have come whether Joseph was able to pay or not. Second, this was Mary's first baby, which tends to be a dangerous time for labor. And so here we have the birth of Jesus, Yeshua in English, Josiah, Jesus the Christ, the bread of life, born in the house of bread, born like a lamb, destined for the ultimate sacrifice. The Messiah, the Lamb of God, who would take away the sins of the world. Here in Bethlehem, as in other parts of our journey in the Holy Land, we visitors found the spiritual and physical sustenance of the risen Lord in a very profound way. Before we leave Bethlehem, a quick note on another visitor to the same cave complex where Jesus was born is in order. About 386 years after Jesus' birth, St. Jerome, a scholar, teacher, author, and monk, entered the same cave complex where Jesus was born. This grating that you see in the picture leads to the cave complex where there is a small living area where it is believed Jesus and Mary stayed with the newborn Jesus before fleeing for Egypt. To the left of the camera, which you don't see, is the entrance down to the same site that was shown previously where we walked down to visit the birth site. The stairwell underneath this graded area here was just too steep for tourists, so they put the grade on top. Jerome, with his small group of followers, spent about 30 years in this cave, taking all the ancient writings from Mark, Luke, Matthew, Paul, and so forth, and translated them from Hebrew into Latin, which became known as the Vulgate. And this was the official Bible for the early Western Church in Rome and most of Western Europe. Some things about Jerome. He was a hermit of sorts. He was a crotchety guy, didn't like to talk with a lot of people, but he was a scholar, and he was very fluent in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And so he preferred to take the original text written in Hebrew in most cases because he didn't trust the earlier translations written in Greek. And a perfect place for a crotchety old guy like that who was a scholar would spend 30 years in a cave complex with his followers. He would translate and they would write, and then he had a few women there to make the meals and take care of the place they were living. In the year 420, Jerome died and he was buried somewhere in Bethlehem. The story of Jesus' birth also includes his flight to Egypt after King Herod heard of a Messiah, a king of Israel, being born in Bethlehem. Historians don't know exactly when to date this flight into Egypt. It was, however, no more than 2 years after Jesus was born, because Herod tried to kill Jesus by slaying all baby boys who had been born in Bethlehem, quote, in the last 2 years. According to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus was born about the time of the first census that took place when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. So his birth occurred between 6 BC and 4 BC. And even though AD dating is supposed to begin with the birth of Christ, it wasn't exactly calculated correctly in the first place. And so AD actually begins a little way into Jesus' life. There are two routes that Joseph and Mary could have taken Jesus to flee into Egypt: the way of the sea along the coast, or the way of shore through the desert. My bet is on the coastal route, which was quicker and not subject to the harsh desert. It's important to know that in eastern Egypt at the time, there were still Jewish communities which lived and thrived under Roman rulers. Egypt at the time had come under the domination of the Roman Empire after the death of Cleopatra. But Herod did not have the authority to send forces into the land if he was prone to follow up and see if anybody was trying to escape. While we do not know when, after the birth of Jesus, he was taken to Egypt, we have a better idea of when he returned. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that after Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." Herod died in 4 BC, and so depending on when Jesus was born, the journey to stay in Egypt lasted no more than 2 years, and perhaps as little as a few weeks or months. It seems the most likely scenario is that Jesus was born about 6 BC because the wise men, by their own account, arrived in Jerusalem about 1.5 years later after they saw the first celestial sign of the star in about 5 to 4 BC. Astronomers can calculate this all the way back to those times. And remember the book of Micah 5:2, which I mentioned twice before in this presentation. When the wise men, who were actually noblemen, journeyed to Bethlehem, they first stopped in Jerusalem to pay their respects to King Herod. When Herod asked what brought them into the area, the wise men mentioned that this star they had been following indicated a new king for all time was to be born in Bethlehem, and they were going there to pay homage. Herod turned to the scribes and Pharisees and asked, "What does this mean?" They replied with those words from Micah, as I mentioned before. King Herod, it says in ancient texts, "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are small, out of you will come for me one who will be the ruler over Israel." Herod, of course, was concerned about any threat to his power, and so he asked the wise men to return to Jerusalem and let him know where the baby was so he could pay homage as well. But of course, as we know this story, the wise men returned by another route. In that same year, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus fled to Egypt, and shortly after that, Herod died, and so they returned. So the length of their time spent in Egypt was probably about a few months. But to end this presentation, recall what the Gospel of Matthew wants us to take away from this episode: a deep appreciation for how Jesus recapitulated the history of Israel in his own life. In Matthew, we see a historical recollection of the Jewish exodus from Egypt, where it says, "Out of Egypt I called my son." And further, Matthew says that through the journey to Egypt and the return from Egypt, Jesus fulfilled this scripture. So that is the presentation on Bethlehem. I would like to leave you with a very short poem that Jesus has for all of you during this Advent season. When we were originally going to have this for people that want to come into the church to listen to it live or those virtually, I had this poem put out on bookmarks, and so we'll figure out a way to hand those out to people that would like them. But I'd like to read this to you. It's very short. It's titled, "If You Look for Me at Christmas." You won't need a special star. I am no longer just in Bethlehem. I'm right there where you are. You may not be aware of me amid the celebrations. You'll have to look beyond the stores and all the decorations. But if you take a moment from that list of things to do and listen to your heart, you'll find I'm waiting there for you. You're the one I want to be with. You're the reason that I came. And you'll find me in the stillness as I am whispering your name. Love, Jesus. Thank you for taking the time this evening to take this journey through Bethlehem. Appreciate it. And we look forward to talking to you again about other parts of Bethlehem. Have a great Advent. God bless.